Hello and welcome to Talk on Things and Stuff. Today we are going to continue our journey covering the story of Stewart Udall. You remember in the last episode, in part 3, we saw that Stewart Udall was a Jack Mormon who was the Secretary of the Interior, a cabinet level government official under JFK, who, when confronted about questions about his status as a Mormon and his desire not to be racist and how that conflicted with Mormon teachings at the time, wrote to the first presidency, was kind of given back a message reinforcing all of the racist teachings and dogma. And so he ended up publishing a letter in Dialogue where he called for the church to end and change and repudiate its racist teachings and enter the era of civil liberties and human dignity and universal brotherhood for all. And today we're going to look at some of the responses that Udall got from church members, because this was made an issue of national importance and was published in newspapers around the world because newspapers saw the letter, the significance of it, that it was coming from a cabinet level official to a major church, and ended up writing about it. And so normal Mormon members around the nation saw what this guy was doing and took it upon themselves to write to him to give them a piece of his mind. And as you will see, what they were telling Mr. Udall reflected, and it's really a unique snapshot into the heart of Mormonism as it stood at that time. And I think exploring this, when I first read these letters, it really helped me see how teachings and policy and statements from the brethren trickle down into the minds and into the lives and the worldview of the members that sustain the brethren. And it really shows you an example of how the head of the church can shape the culture and outlook of the membership. And so it turns out this particular episode of the Stewart Udall sequence was so important to me. I ended up creating a separate presentation and doing an audio recording a few years ago because there were a lot of parallels with how the membership of the church was dealing with people who were outspoken in criticism of the church's 2015 policy, which declared people who were gay, who were married, as apostates and forbade baptism or confirmation for the children of gay parents. And so what I'm going to do is basically start that presentation. This is a little bit longer because you have to go through all the different letters and responses. We're not going to read all of the letters, but the most salient points. And really, by the end of this, you should have a good sense of exactly what type of response the general membership would give to anyone who was critical of things that the brethren taught or teach or say. So let's go ahead and get this set up, and then we will go from there. Let me take us to full screen, and we'll go ahead and
thoughtsonThingsandStuff.com. In parts 1 through 3 of
I'll restart that so that we have
Who's on the Lord's Side? Who? Stewart Udall Sequence Part 4. thoughtsonThingsandStuff.com. In parts 1 through 3 of this series, we were introduced to Stewart Udall, a Jack Mormon who made a conscience-driven separation from the church in his early adult life. Despite his departure from the saints, Udall lived a life of moral courage in a time of racism and segregation, culminating in a public letter to the editor in the Mormon journal Dialogue in 1967. He wrote the letter while sitting in office as Secretary of the Interior, the highest-ranking and most visible Mormon in political office at the time. His letter was an appeal for full fellowship of black men and women in the church and a call to abandon false teachings about a divine curse which had served to justify religious segregation within Mormonism itself. It is helpful to review the main points of Udall's letter. Society is awakening to the concepts of racial equality and universal brotherhood. As a result, the LDS Church teachings and policies on black people will come under criticism. Church teachings and policy about blacks is wrong and must be changed. Church teachings and policy hurt the black members and degrade the white members. Early Mormons held non-racist views which were changed for expediency. As the policy of polygamy was changed, so too can the teachings and policy on race. The giving of the priesthood to black members had been prophesied. Surely that day has come. While Udall received several letters congratulating him on his courageous stand, many more letters were received from members who disagreed with his position. Remember that in writing a public, open letter, Udall was airing Mormonism's dirty laundry for all the world to see. He essentially called every prophet from Brigham Young onward a false teacher in regards to race. He contradicted the most widely held interpretations of Scripture about a divine curse and skin color. As a member outside of church leadership, he committed the sin of attempting to tell church authorities where they were wrong and what they should be doing. All of these things are strictly taboo in Mormon church culture even today. What do you suppose the other rank-and-file members, seeing a public figure call out their beloved prophet and doctrine in such a way, would say to Udall if they had a chance? The responses. Well, it is possible to find out. After Stewart Udall's very public career and a life in government and environmental activism, he donated his papers to the University of Arizona. In his collection, he kept a file of all the responses he received from members after publishing his letter. Those letters serve as a sort of time capsule of Mormon attitudes and thought about race, deference to authority, and interpersonal relations between Orthodox and unorthodox members of the church. In each instance, the Mormon who wrote to castigate Udall was empowered to feel completely justified because they were defending the position which the very prophet and apostles of Christ had told them was right for their entire lives. Rather than look at the several letters individually, let's examine the themes that showed up in letter after letter, which began to paint a picture of how Mormons had been culturally trained to deal with those who dissent. I present extracted comments that Udall received sorted by theme. Attacking the messenger. By insulting Udall, readers may have felt that they could negate any of the issues or points that he made. This is a common ad hominem argument which diverts attention from the issue at hand. I think your letter to the magazine trying to tell the LDS Church what to do about the Negro is asinine, out of gear, and certainly you must be out of your mind. Are you running out of problems to solve? Who made you so omnipotent that you feel you can solve a problem Abel could not solve, nor apparently Adam, nor Lincoln, nor Eisenhower, nor Truman, nor that violence maker Martin Luther King? Negative letter 8. Throughout the history of the church, it has followed a consistent pattern that all informed, unworthy, disloyal, and apostate members are quick to try to outline the affairs of the church and set it in order. The more a member of the church breaks the laws of God and disregards the statutes of the church, the more he will tell others how to live them. Negative letter 12. You absolute nut! Why don't you shout down Negro bias? The Carmichael and the Kings and the Muslim, why don't you hit where the enemy lies? Negative letter 14. You like to shoot off your mouth about the church with your errors. You are an ignorant man, lacking in knowledge and understanding of the gods. You can get a bill passed in U.S. making polygamy legal again. Adults involved consenting is legal. Negative letter 20. It is strange that a man with as much knowledge would use such little wisdom in expressing himself. We are living in a day when those in high political offices should be working for peace and goodwill among all people instead of stirring up unrest. Negative letter 26. Sir, you are a disgrace to all humanity. Negative letter 38. Appeal to majority. Some readers took comfort in the fact that they saw many of their fellow Mormons react with the same revulsion that they did when reading Udall's letter. Since Mormons excel at following the teachings of the brethren at the head of the church, then it is no surprise that they would find themselves in the majority of members who heeded the call to follow the prophet when it came to issues of race. It was Udall and any liberal, progressive, intellectual Mormons who supported him who were in the minority and went against the teachings of the church. An appeal to the majority, or argumentum ad populum, is another fallacious argument which diverts attention away from the issues at hand. I thought it fitting that you know how members of the LDS Church, and perhaps all, feel about a ridiculous and stupid statement on your part. Negative letter 12. Is it colossal ignorance or political viciousness? I recently shared the extremely disgusting experience of reading a feature article on the front page of Nevada's largest newspaper entitled End LDS Bias, Udall. I say shared because, without exception, every member of the church of high and low position with whom I have discussed your demand has looked upon it with utter disdain and incredulity. Negative letter 14. I, as thousands of other people, have been extremely upset at a recent news article published under an Associated Press dateline. My feelings are such that I feel a desire to communicate them to you. It is difficult for me to understand why an individual with your religious background, education, and political stature would make such an offhand comment concerning the Mormon religion and their revealed doctrines concerning the Negroes. Negative letter 24. After reading that article in the Arizona Republic quoting you, your ideas as to the stand the church leaders should take towards the Negroes has provoked me to the point I can't refrain from writing you. Every LDS feels as I do, and also many others that are not LDS. What was your motive? Did you feel that it would raise your prestige, or make you appear broader-minded and to have risen above social customs as you intimated the church leaders were bonded to? Negative letter 26. I wish to inform you that many people, including myself, think that you are absolutely wrong in your ideas and behavior. Negative letter 41. Jack Mormons don't count. By pointing out Udall's status as a less than orthodox member, some readers were able to invalidate any of the points that Udall made. This is a special type of ad hominem argument known as poisoning the well, in which the person making the argument is discredited as an individual, serving to negate the import of any arguments that are made. This fallacious rhetorical advice also serves to detract from directly confronting the issues that Udall raised. Why are you trying to get the priesthood for other people when you value it so lightly? Negative letter 1. Prior to examining the substance of your position, I would like to examine you as an individual, to ascertain why you deem yourself a fit spokesman for the church. I certainly will not nor cannot judge, Mr. Secretary, but I have been told by several sources, including high-level Washington sources when I attended law school there, that you do not, in any substantial measure, adhere to the standards of the church. Is that true? Do you possess a temple recommend, Mr. Secretary? Are you living a life worthy of obtaining one? Do you live the word of wisdom, pay a full tithing, etc.? If you answer the aforementioned questions in the negative, then it is obvious why you would brazenly demand that the church forsake the words of the Lord and fall in line with the other churches. The church simply has no place of real meaning in your life. Negative letter 14. The statement in which you startled most of us Utahns with the demand on our church leaders that they should change their pious ways and allow the Negro the priesthood, I don't suppose you have ever held the priesthood, or you wouldn't have said what you did. This really surprises me coming from a member of the LDS Church. I heard rumored that you were a member on paper. This explains a great deal. By the way, did you make the statement as a member of the LDS Church or as an apostate? Just curious. I suggest that you do a little more reading of the standard works of the church and less talking. Negative letter 16. But perhaps you have never humbled yourself enough to get a testimony, and you cannot turn traitor to a God you have never known. Unless you cease your arrogance, you will grow more bitter. The church may not disfellowship you or even pay any attention to your sniping. Negative letter 19. It seems to me that you have 1 foot in the church, 1 foot in your governmental job, and an extra foot in your mouth. How can you possibly accept Joseph Smith as a prophet of God, the Book of Mormon and other canonized books as divinely inspired, and then defy the living prophet? The only answer I can find is that you do not believe in the restoration of the gospel, and therefore it is quite easy to defy the prophet and recommend changes in doctrine. For if you believed in the restored church, you would be obeying the commandments and following the teachings of God's chosen leaders in these last days. Your recommends for doctrinal changes within the church are then as valid as my doctrinal recommends would be to the Catholic leaders. I, as you, am not qualified to demand changes. Negative letter 22. If the priesthood is so important to you, Mr. Udall, why are you not honoring it? Is your life so full of party politics, the Great Society, that you have moved away from the belief structure of your parents? Is it now that you're so concerned with your job that you want to focus national attention on something that you think would be damaging to God-fearing people? Negative letter 24. As I understand it, you are not a good Mormon anymore. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but anyone that would make such a statement surely can't have the belief and faith that he should have if he is a true member. Negative letter 29. To quote you, there is a sad irony indeed, and that sad irony is that you have accrued so many benefits from your being a Mormon without giving anything of yourself to the church. For example, when benefits for Mormons are to be derived, you are first in line, but you've effectively shielded yourself from any responsibility for demonstrating your faith by blatantly disclaiming doctrines held sacred by worthy Mormons as merely borrowed superstitions. Your parasitic relationship with the church disqualifies you from being its spokesman. Regarding the Negro position, we look to a chosen prophet for revelation and not to a government official who has given the church little support for over a quarter of a century and then sanctimoniously declares, "Surely that day has come." Negative letter 33. On the fact that you were a lifetime member and of the pioneer heritage of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, this I find hard to believe. After a disgraceful comment such as this, unless, sir, you are a member by means of being born under the covenant and not an active priesthood holder. Negative letter 38. Would appreciate knowing what priesthood you hold, what offices you have held in the church. Would also like to know what ward you reside in and in what state. It was my understanding that you were inactive for a number of years, and it would be interesting to know when you again became active and in a position to speak for the Mormon Church. Negative letter 45. Political motive. Since Udall was a Democrat, some readers felt that his motivation was to raise an issue which would embarrass George Romney, who was a Mormon Republican thought to have the best chance at winning the presidency in the upcoming election. Others thought that his letter was an attempt to mix politics and religion. In either event, an assumed ulterior political motive allowed these readers to discount Udall's arguments. Do you want the Democrats here to lose? We don't. Negative letter 1. If you suppose that the priesthood is a political item that can be given or taken away by the whims of political pressure, then you yourself are not worthy to hold this responsibility before the throne of heaven and men. Negative letter 4. If you had more faith, you might understand that the criteria for revelation are not man's needs, but rather God's will. Our church is not a democracy, nor has it ever pretended to be one, but rather it is a theocracy based on the authority given to the prophet Joseph Smith via a visitation from God himself. Educational, political, economic, social, and other organizations can well be changed via your dissenting comments, but the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not to be an instrument in the hands of would-be reformers. The principles espoused by the Church are eternal in nature, and God's own final judgment will decide the propriety of his laws and ordinances. Negative letter 7. The root of all present racial trouble is interference in the internal affairs of the southern states by people not at all interested in the settlement of any problems arising between the Negro and the white Americans. This interference comes from organizations and individuals in the North seeking to use the Negro. Among them are found communists, fuzzy-headed liberals, eggheads, pacifists, idealists, do-gooders, conniving politicians, self-seekers, and civil disobedience kits. They employ situations which inflame and agitate the white populace and use it as white propaganda. The Civil Rights Bill is 90% communist and 10% civil rights. Negative letter 13. If you and the rest of the Great Society would encourage the Negro to work and live for the respect and equality they desire, as your pioneer forebears had to do, rather than incite and encourage them to riot and civil disobedience, we would all see an accelerated arrival of a brotherhood of all men. Sincerely, but not respectfully yours. P.S. If your ill-advised pronouncement was an effort to deter Governor Romney's potential progress, I can offer you nothing but pity. Negative letter 14. I don't know what you thought you had to gain by challenging the authorities and the prophets of the church, but it must have been political. You may have gained a few votes in Harlem, but you lost a lot of them in Utah. When a man puts politics before his church, he's asking for trouble. Negative letter 15. It is apparent that you're attempting to use the church as a political tool against Governor George Romney in the forthcoming general elections. Whatever you think of Governor Romney as a presidential candidate is, of course, your privilege, but in using your own interpretation of the teachings of the church to bias the mind of the public, you have gone too far. Negative letter 17. Your obvious attempt to include the church in your partisan liberal ideas irritates me to a high degree. The political government is not the savior of the people. Many governments and forms of government have set themselves up as the supreme authority. In time, they all decay because of their own corruption. I suggest that you should confine your activities to the Department of Interior and quit trying to command the Lord or his prophets for your own political reasons. Negative letter 23. It is well known in both church and political circles that your appointment as Secretary of the Interior came by virtue of your supposed identification with the Mormon ethnic and certainly not from your marginal personal qualifications. In these tactics, however, you have been most opportunistic. We can only hope that your strange and uncalled-for proclamations will be recognized by thinking people as an extremely unethical attempt to embarrass Governor George Romney of Michigan. May we suggest that you review his civil rights record? It far outshines your own. Negative letter 33. In my opinion, a Mormon Democrat who adheres to the present-day Democrat platform is one who places his shoes on the wrong feet and tries to walk in society that way, each foot stepping further apart until your doctrine is split up the middle, dissolving into a phantom. Granted, a politician must build a shield for self-defense from his enemies, but many build a sarcophagus and bury themselves and their families from the face of man and God. Negative letter 34. Regarding your newspaper statements in connection with the Mormon Church versus the Negro, to my thinking, it is about as low a blow you could make regarding our church, myself being an LDS, and the biggest motive I can think of in your making such statements as now is the time to bring the Negro into full fellowship, etc., can only be based on desperate political expediency in bid for votes in the coming election. I further feel that if I were a Democrat, your statements would be a disservice to the party. Should you feel your political needs require the Negro support, then I, for one, suggest most strongly, leave the Mormon Church out of it. Negative letter 44. Priesthood a burden to blacks. Some readers took the unique approach of explaining to Udall just how much of a burden the priesthood was and describing how black men are better off without it. This demonstrates a clear lack of empathy and a paternalistic attitude on the part of these members, but served to assuage their privilege by projecting a sour grapes rationalization onto black members. When you remember how your grandfather and then your father were saddled with the office of bishop and other Mormon priestly offices all their adult lives, I'm surprised that you could humanely wish such burdens on others. This differentiation was all to the Negro's advantage. Negative letter 2. The author of this letter then goes on to list what he considers the advantages of not holding the priesthood to be, including more sleep without having to attend meetings, less guilt for Sabbath breaking, less priestly burden of helping and ministering to others, etc. Read the full letter to get the idea. I have the Book of Mormon opened up to 2nd Nephi. For the laborer in Zion shall labor for Zion, for if they labor for money they shall perish. As you know, being ordained to the priesthood does not mean the receiving of a purple robe and a life of ease. You are still under the commandment, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. Would our black brethren be interested in obtaining the priesthood if they knew that? Negative letter 18. As it is now, he, the black man, is better off than you and I, as he will go to heaven without working for it. The Lord will not keep a person out of heaven because he cannot hold the priesthood if it is not time for him to hold this office. On the other hand, if a person is permitted to hold this office, as you and I, we have to keep the Sabbath day holy, pay an honest tithing, observe the word of wisdom, and go to the temple for ourselves and those that have gone before us, and do all the things that a priesthood holder has to do. If we don't, there is only one place for us to go, and that is hell with Satan and his angels. But the Negro only has to be baptized and keep the commandments of God. But all the extra work connected with the priesthood he does not need to do because God does not require it of him. In other words, he is a favored child of God and not one that is deprived of salvation. The Negro cannot be a son of perdition, but you and I can. Why? Because we hold the priesthood of God in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Negative letter 42. Blacks accept the ban. Some members felt that if their black friends understood and accepted the ban, then there was no reason to agitate for a change. As such, Udall's only motive could have been to cause problems for the church. I have served with various Negro people in positions of responsibility within the Mormon Church that have accepted the revealed explanation of their present denial of the priesthood. They are also aware of the future eternal opportunities that will be made available to them. What are you doing with your future eternal opportunities? Negative letter 24. If President McKay were to say, the Lord has made it known that all LDS Negroes eligible for the priesthood are to receive it, how many of the vast Negro race would that affect? A comparatively small handful would be included. Those few LDS Negroes are not among those who are making an issue of it. They are happy in being members of Christ's church and are joyfully looking forward to that promised day when they will be given the priesthood. They realize that they have so much more than those who are not members. No, it isn't the LDS Negroes who are making an issue of it. Communistic agitators and a few others who are stirring up the trouble. Negative letter 26. Furthermore, the church does not actively seek Negro members, but do not deny membership to those who seek it. The Negroes in the church understand why they are not permitted to hold the priesthood, and it is only those who know nothing about the church who seem to be raising the fuss. And what a shame it is that you are agitating them. Negative letter 27. We have many well-educated, intelligent Negroes who live and work here, and I have discussed our church and the limitations placed upon the Negro in it. I've been pleasantly surprised at times to find that many of them agree with this limitation. Their belief is that God in his own time will remove this limitation, and that, as promised by biblical and modern-day prophecy, they, the Negroes, will have the same opportunities as other men. Negative letter 43. Blacks undeserving of the priesthood. This lamentable argument, unfortunately, is also one which reinforces the doctrine which was used to justify the ban. For your information, I can promise you that the Negroes will never be given the rights of the priesthood except they humble themselves before the Lord in righteousness and obedience. They cannot and will not gain this right or privilege by or through riots, marches, or the pressure of faithless men such as yourself who do not know or understand the eternal nature and significance of this right and calling before the Lord. It would be no blessing to the Negroes to have the priesthood before they are ready and willing to assume the responsibilities and consequences connected with this office in the kingdom of God. To give them the impression that they can gain entrance into this office and calling other than through repentance, humility, and obedience to the Lord is a disservice to them or any other race or person on earth. Negative letter 4. Have you hired a Negro in your own home or enterprise? Do you think you have enough common sense to save a few dollars and withdraw one of these poor, ill-favored people from their morass of corruption and spiritual weakness? Negative letter 8. The fact that God has seen fit to create a disability, i.e., the withholding of the priesthood, from certain of his children who were disobedient in the pre-existent life is a condition we cannot alter. The fact that we discipline or deprive certain members of our own family because of disobedient acts doesn't mean that we love them any less. Of course, I know your position conforms with the popular notion that God merely and capriciously mixed up a batch of children, some of whom were white, others black, and some yellow, in order to provide interest and variety. I pity those who consider such a concept deserving of belief. Negative letter 14. You also call the doctrine of pre-existence a borrowed superstition, and the church authorities have strayed and compromised. If you have a better explanation as to why the Negroes are born so handicapped, you should publish it so all may know. Surely no one envies them in their native land or their color or status. Negative letter 19. I would appreciate an explanation from you as to how the priesthood has become so almighty important to people who never before were even interested in the restored gospel. We must remember that a testimony in baptism must be accomplished before any male member is allowed to even be considered for the priesthood. What are you going to do now to assist in the conversion and baptism of these people so that from the day they will be allowed full fellowship in the restored church? Negative letter 24. Members should know their place. To anyone who grew up in the Mormon culture, it should not be surprising that this section is by far the longest. This thread is woven into almost every letter Udall received. Members should not question the leaders. Seek not to counsel your God. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. Let's let the Lord decide when to reveal a change concerning the priesthood. Negative letter 3. Your insistent demands that the LDS Church bestow the rights of the priesthood of God on the Negro race are somewhat foolish and vain, as whether or not the Negroes gain this privilege is between them and the Lord, not between you or I. Just because you happen to be in a currently powerful political position in the world does not give you the right or responsibility to dictate what the Lord must do to his children, whether they be Negroes or any other race upon the face of the earth. Negative letter 4. I am very much displeased with you as a public servant and as a representative of the LDS Church. Do you think that the Lord has discontinued to give his word and instruction to his prophet and has now spoken to a lay member of the church? Makes me happy to know really where the truth is. I have always been taught to keep my eye on the prophet and not a person who claims because of his government position to be in the know-how concerning church doctrine. Negative letter 5. The fact that your parents were Mormons before you were born does not make you an authority on running the affairs of the Church of Jesus Christ. Negative letter 6. Have you no civility nor sympathies for our leaders burdened with so many unsolved problems? Or who do you think you are to presume you can force by public declaration on man, David O. McKay, to open up the windows of security on the Negroes? Are you beyond polite personal communication? Negative letter 8. Too many people have the mistaken concept that this is a convention of man and can merely be altered by decision of a committee or council. This is not possible when one realizes the nature of our church and its complete dependence on revelations, for which is the only means that the revelation concerning the denial of the priesthood unto the Negro can be changed. It is not for a priesthood holder to contend with the church or the general authorities on matters concerning direct revelation by speculation. It is rather his responsibility and obligation to see that it be promulgated and carried out. It is scriptural doctrine that the Negro will receive the priesthood when the time comes. This time will be revealed by revelation and not due to political or social expediency or any other means. Negative letter 10. You know what happened to Lucifer when he told God how to run affairs? In a God-inspired church, even the highest don't dare tell God our Father how to run the affairs on earth. Don't make a fool of yourself for your worthy ancestors' sake. Negative letter 11. It is the Lord's priesthood, and he has the power to designate to whom it shall be given, and that power of designation has never been given to man. You certainly owe an apology to President David O. McKay. Negative letter 13. The fact that you, Mr. Secretary, and others like you in the churches of the world, as it were, seek in ignorance to deride and malign the church and its ordained authorities, and persuade, through pressure and innuendo, said church and authorities to a supposed popular position, will do nothing more than cause us to resolve the stronger to sustain truth at all cost. Negative letter 14. A few of the left-wing church members seem to think that this doctrine is man-made. This, fortunately, is not true. This doctrine comes directly from our Father in heaven, for which I'm grateful. When our Father in heaven decides the time is right for the prophet to change the doctrine of the church, I'm sure this will be done, but not until. Leave the affairs of the LDS church doctrine to the leaders of the church. Negative letter 16. Why don't you run the Interior Department and let the general authorities administer the doctrines of the Mormon Church? If the Lord wants these doctrines changed, I feel he's capable of sending an angel to the proper authority and giving them instruction. If the Lord felt you are the one to establish his doctrines, why then were you not called to be president of the church instead of Mr. McKay? Negative letter 21. The Lord's purposes will move on. You must realize that the Mormon Church is, in actuality, the Church of Jesus Christ. Evidence, both scientific and spiritual, are testaments to this fact, and any sincere person who would believe this message. You must humble yourself from your high throne and seek the scriptures before seeking doctrinal change through changing social conditions. We're not Catholics, Mr. Udall. When the time comes, the Lord will speak, but not through the Secretary of the Interior or any other branch of government. Negative letter 22. You say the issue of the colored people in the priesthood must be solved. May I ask you a question? Who are you to instruct the Lord's prophet? Further, is it any of your business how the Lord establishes his priesthood on his earth? Negative letter 23. If you know anything about church government, you should know that David O. McKay is the mouthpiece of God, and he does not take such matters in his own hands as it appears that you are going to have him do. This, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is not just another social organization that can change its laws and bylaws to suit the will of its members. Jesus Christ is still at the head of his church, and his will be carried out by those who have been called to do so. Remember what happened to that one of the children of Israel who tried to steady the Ark of the Covenant after they had all been told not to touch it? Take that as a parable unto yourself, and don't try to tell President McKay what to do. Negative letter 26. Could it be that you have forgotten the church was organized through divine revelation from God and is still guided from him through our prophet David O. McKay? I'm sure no one in Washington, D.C., including yourself, can take it upon themselves to make any changes. Negative letter 27. There's one thing you've forgotten with your background as a Mormon. The Lord spoke to his prophet Brigham Young concerning the law of plural marriage. He and he alone will direct his prophet on earth today, President David O. McKay. Nothing anyone tries to do will change that fact. The people of the world will change their religions to fit their personal desires, birth control, etc. But this isn't from God. The world will not understand God's will by this type of demanding. We, as Latter-day Saints, should not be weak like the world and dare to think that we can demand anything from our prophet. This is a privilege we earned to prepare ourselves for eternal life, and I abhor your tactics. Negative letter 28. You are lacking in that one great principle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to wit, to support the general authorities of the church. I'm a convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, having come into the church in August 1957 at the age of 51, and I know better than to make statements past, present, and future that you are supposed to have made. Negative letter 30. I cannot help but believe you're not so presumptuous as to believe the reasoning of man preempts the wisdom of God, who reveals nothing except through his prophets. Negative letter 37. The wording of your letter indicates that you were telling the general authorities what to do, instead of voicing your personal opinion in the form of a suggestion. You also completely disregard the fact that this church is run by Jesus Christ by direct revelation. We do not have council meetings to debate and change doctrines. Negative letter 39. The fifth article of faith says, "We believe that a man must be called of God." What right and authority have you to teach doctrine which is contrary to the earliest church and try to make it appear as church doctrine? I hope President McKay, who has power and authority, will tell you to mind your own business and not informed, predict, or prophesy regarding the doctrine of the LDS Church. You have authority to tell others when to open and close headgates on big dams, but please don't assume that you have any right nor power to tell the leaders of the LDS Church what they should do. Negative letter 41. I'd like to ask you how you can get the Lord to come and give a revelation when and what you want. We believe that the LDS Church is led by revelation, and this information has to come from God, and it is His desires, not man's wishes towards His people. Negative letter 42. I am well aware of our individual right to our own opinions, and I exercise it frequently. However, this question is not one in which I feel that any member is qualified to judge. I'm sure that you are aware that we should support church authorities in all matters pertaining to our spiritual welfare. I do, and I do not question the wisdom. I think you should too. One thing I would like to make clear: God does not speak to us as individuals or collectively except on matters that pertain only to us as individuals. He has a prophet on the earth, and he speaks to him. Negative letter 43. Stop trying to be the prophet. A good Mormon sustains the leaders of his church. Are you a good Mormon? If you've been through the temple, you have stated that you would uphold the leaders of our church. Why do you publicly try to force the prophet to change the church's position? Negative letter 47. Thou shalt not embarrass the church. To many readers, Udall's main sin wasn't the fact that he had asked the questions, but rather the fact that his open letter embarrassed the church, possibly scaring away potential converts. To think that you, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, could be so helpful as a missionary in your important position, and then you allow such a release in the newspaper, makes me ashamed to think that we have such people in our church. Instead of building up the kingdom of God, you're tearing it apart and making it very difficult for the church to move ahead. Negative letter 5. It is misquotation and apparent dissensions such as this which void all good efforts of the missionary program and individual members of the church. Negative letter 10. If apostates like you would keep their mouths shut, there would not be any reproach brought upon the church in the minds of the uninformed or ill-informed public. Negative letter 19. Just what kind of Latter-day Saint are you? You certainly weren't thinking very straight when you made front-page criticism of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints regarding the Negroes not permitted to hold the priesthood of the church. Negative letter 27. Why don't you try to correct this thing instead of putting our church up to ridicule? What you have said won't bother me, but you have done irreparable damage to many who were just ready to come into the church or who were being a little lax. I think you should get down on your knees and ask God's forgiveness for the harm you have done. Maybe he will forgive you. Negative letter 29. There are proper channels of authority and discreet methods of doing this which I feel you have grossly violated, and in doing so have caused a great deal of harm to the church's public image, and have also created dissension, confusion, and dismay among the members of the church in general. You should have presented your ideas to your bishopric, and then to the stake presidency, and finally to the first presidency. Also, and most important, this should have been done in privacy and in a confidential manner, rather than an open letter to a publication that would eventually reach the general mass media and gain nationwide publicity. Negative letter 39. You are ignorant. Many readers felt that the only way Udall could hold the views that he did was that he really wasn't knowledgeable about true doctrine. They wrote to inform him of that fact. From an article in the New York Times, I learned of a letter you had written to the Dialogue stating our church was wrong with withholding the priesthood from the Negroes. If you knew as much about the gospel as you do about the affairs of state, you never would have written such a letter. The priesthood was withheld from the Negroes by God himself for reasons unknown to man. In case you're interested, this information, withholding the priesthood from the Negroes, is found in the Pearl of Great Price as a revelation given to Enoch the prophet at the time. If you are a good Latter-day Saints, some serious thought and study should be worked into your busy schedule so that you will not make remarks of this kind. Negative letter 6. I just finished reading the Los Angeles Times article, End Mormon Racial Bias, Udall urges. I felt it necessary to express my sympathy to you for your apparent lack of knowledge and testimony of the truthfulness of the gospel. Negative letter 7. If you had been a lifelong active member of the church, I do not believe that you would have made the irresponsible statements that you have made. I can only assume that in reality you have very little understanding of the teachings of the church. Negative letter 17. I read your article in Dialogue pertaining to the acceptance of the Negro into the priesthood of our church, and it brought to mind the saying, "He who knows nothing speaks most about it." Negative letter 37. Get out of the church. If you don't support the racist teachings of the church, then get out. This loving concept was communicated to Udall in a number of ways. Of course, if you covet the stewardship presently invested in President David O. McKay, then perhaps you might prefer to lead another dissenting group away from the church, a move similar to that which was led away after the death of Joseph Smith. Negative letter 7. If you don't fully understand your own religion, why don't you transfer to some other faith? It's obvious you don't understand your own church's teachings. Negative letter 9. If I believed that my church was the last to receive the Word of God, I would most assuredly change. Maybe this is the logical thing for you to do. Go with those who conform and adjust their doctrines to the popular notions of so-called majorities. Negative letter 14. If our church is true, that the policy is true, and it is instigated by God, not by man. If I were in your shoes, I would make a public apology to our prophet David O. McKay and Joseph Smith soon. If not, I wouldn't consider myself a member of the church. You have apostatized anymore. If you do not do this, I hope the authorities excommunicate you. Negative letter 15. Should you persist in following the line of thought as outlined in the Arizona Republic, supposedly over your name, I suggest that you request that your name be removed from the membership rolls of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Negative letter 30. Scriptural defense. Many readers took it upon themselves to point out certain scriptures and church historical facts which support the racist teachings about the priesthood ban. It is interesting to note that while the ban has been removed and the folklore has been disavowed, these scriptures remain canon. Members have had to resort to distorted interpretation of these scriptures in order to avoid their obvious literal meanings. For it is prescribed in the scriptures, in the Pearl of Great Price, Abraham chapter 1, verse 27, it says, "Now Pharaoh, being of that lineage by which he could not have the right of priesthood." It mentions in verse 2 of the same chapter, "And thus from Ham sprang that race which preserved the curse in the land." And this original curse is described in Moses chapter 7, verse 22. "And Enoch also beheld the residue of the people which were the sons of Adam, and they were a mixture of all the seeds of Adam, save it was the seed of Cain, for the seed of Cain were black and had not place among them." The curse is further described in verse 36 and 37 of chapter 5 of Moses. Negative letter 10. The teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith were that the Negro cannot hold the priesthood. He had his chance of the pre-existence and he rejected it. Negative letter 13. You call for a resolution of the Negro problem within the church, but not by what you refer to as pious moralistic platitudes. May I ask you to what you are referring? Is the Book of Mormon a pious moralistic platitude? Are the Pearl of Great Price, Doctrine and Covenants, and Bible pious moralistic platitudes? Indeed, is modern revelation a pious moralistic platitude? I cannot understand your statements in light of the following scriptures. Udall, I presume you are quite familiar with the scriptures, both ancient and modern, and therefore there was no need for me to quote scriptures. I know that no doctrinal changes will come through secular pressure. Negative letter 22. I read with disgust your article, Udall Prods Mormons to Solve Negro Issue. You evidently have not studied the scriptures as it pertains to the Negro. Had you studied the scriptures in regards to the Negro, you would not permit the above-mentioned article over your name. I suggest that you read the following before you indulge in any more articles on the Negro question. Mormonism and the Negro by John J. Stewart. I suggest that you study the references given in this book. The Book of Moses, the Pearl of Great Price, Genesis 9, Numbers 25, etc. Negative letter 30. Your letter was an attack. By framing Udall's letter as an attack, readers could then take the role of the victim. This distracts from the issue at hand. It was with regret that I read your attack upon the church in the Deseret News. When a member of the church raises the Negro issue as you have done, you're really telling the world that you do not believe we have a prophet and are guided by God through divine communication. Negative letter 13. I cannot understand your thinking on the Negro issue, and I believe you are damaging yourself, the church, and mankind in general by your statements, which are, to me, completely unrealistic. Negative letter 22. God supports segregation. Some people look to the scriptures to see segregation as a divine attribute. This is a common defense of the priesthood ban even today. When the Lord chose the nations to which the spirits were to come, determining that some would be Japanese and some would be Chinese and some Negroes and some Americans, he engaged in active segregation. When he preserved his people Israel in Egypt 400 years, he engaged in active segregation. The Jews were segregated, and also the Mormons. Negative letter 13. USA is a polyglot of people of many nations. There would be confusion if both whites and blacks were the priesthood. So in my opinion, in USA, it is reserved to the whites, and they are duty-bound as God's servants to bless the blacks with the priesthood. Negative letter 18. It was God who divided unto the nations their inheritances and set the bounds of the people. It was he who made all nations and determined when and where. Negative letter 19. Judaism teaches only the tribe of Levi, whites, are priests, Kohanim. Gentiles and Negroes cannot hold the priesthood. God said to Israel that Israel would be to him a kingdom of priests. Negroes are impostors pretending to be priests of God. God is a racist. Many people of white race are Israelites. Original, true Israelites are a white race. Israelites were told not to marry with other races of people. The state of Israel law forbids a Jew to marry a non-Jew. Jesus Christ was a racist. Negative letter 20. Although your statements may have caused untold damage or harm to our church, I hope you can discuss this with your bishop. Then you will understand this very important truth, that our church doesn't teach the doctrine of men, but of our Father in heaven. Since this is true, the very character of Mormonism can't be distorted or crippled by adherence to what our Heavenly Father has revealed. Negative letter 35. To your way of thinking, a true Latter-day Saint may be a bigot and may not conform to the great stream of modern and social thoughts, but at least true believers know that our prophet's wisdom is far greater than that of others existing on earth today, as we dare not undo revelation that took the struggle of thousands of people, many of whom lost their lives, to defend. Negative letter 40. Special mention. There are a few letters which are difficult to categorize. One includes a comparison with the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, which, if taken literally, means that every Catholic is a cannibal. The author then goes on to urge Udall to take a stand against Catholic cannibalism as well. See letter 20. Another remarkable letter is one that was sent in by a primary-age child. I am 13 years old, and I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I've just read an article in the Honolulu Advertiser which has said that you urge the church to change its attitudes as far as the Negroes go. I firmly believe that the church is divinely inspired, as are all of its teachings. If you really consider yourself to be a member of the church, then you would realize that we practice not letting Negroes hold the priesthood because we have been commanded to do so by our Heavenly Father. I must say, I'm very disappointed in you. You may or may not realize it, but you have sorely hurt the church. I doubt if this will change your thinking in any. However, I feel that I should tell you that both my mother and I am disappointed in you. Wouldn't you be if the person you voted for wasn't all you thought he was? Negative letter 32. Finally, a member from California wrote and castigated Stewart Udall and all other church members who bear the name Udall in a remarkable fit of linguistic barbs. My husband knew and grew up with all the numerous Udalls and know what they would do for their own skin, for their own point. And now we have one of your family to put up with in our ward, Studio City, Burbank State, California, and he is just your type, and no one loves him. Negative letter 46. Conclusion. Gordon B. Hinckley taught that if you don't stand for something, then you will fall for anything. In 1967, at the time of Udall's letter, every single one of the members who wrote to him were standing for something. They were standing up for the teachings of the scriptures, the modern prophets, and their religion. Mormons asking themselves, who's on the Lord's side who, knew that they stood with God because they were repeating the teachings of the church leaders. They would see Udall's letter as an affront to the church and to the doctrines of God. By attacking Udall, they believed they were taking the Lord's side and defending the truth. Looking back, we see these exchanges in a different light. Udall was standing for truth while the members were standing for error. Udall was on the side of brotherhood while the members who attacked him were on the side of a doctrine of religiously sanctioned hate and white supremacy, things which could not be of the Lord. Like crabs attacked who would dwell on all of these hateful things written in the letters to Udall. Those are all old backwards notions that are not part of the church today. Is that true? I've spoken with a board member of Ordained Women, and they have received messages from members with the exact same sorts of arguments. I've seen numerous Facebook discussions about dealing with LGBT members that read very similarly. The ban has been lifted, but the culture which prompted these letters has not changed. When Ordained Women board members are lectured that women are better off without the priesthood or incompatible with those responsibilities, we are reminded that members still value dogma and paternalism over thoughtful questioning and empathy. We see the same threads of the primacy of obedience and deference to church leaders when members who express support for women ordination are assumed to be in apostasy and told that they are in the wrong church and should go start their own. The same closed-minded attitude towards outsiders is revealed when members disregard non-Mormon pleas for inclusive weddings that welcome all family members apart from temple ceilings without a year-long wait. Underlying all of these cultural attitudes is the unquestioned premise that the leaders who interpret and reveal doctrine are correct simply because they hold positions of authority in the church. The unfortunate result of this premise is that without any critical thought, earnest empathy, or introspection, members feel empowered to tear down people who find a moral footing outside of the orthodox dogma of the church. This lamentable situation creates a membership that is inexperienced in analyzing complex moral issues without the crutch of an appeal to authority. Their answer to the relevant questions invariably can be traced to a church leader who issued a decree which is then believed on the basis of an assumed divine appointment. The practice of starting with a root moral principle and reasoning through an issue on the merit of one's own conscience and without a deference to church authority is a skill that is being left to the Jack Mormons of the world, like Udall in his day. Let's learn from the past. When the dialogue has devolved into echoes of the sentiments we see in the above letters, step back and remember that church leaders have been wrong before. Their errors seeped into the hearts of the membership and gave sanction to hate. If we are to avoid the same mistake, we must each find our own conscience and not simply outsource our morality to men who have betrayed that trust in the past.
All right. That was a long one, I admit. So, for those of you that were able to stay around for it, thank you. I will go ahead. It's late, and I set this up after the fact, so I don't anticipate that there'll be much in the way of calls, but I'll go ahead and set that up. If you give me just a second, let's see what we can do. Okay, so there were a couple of things that came across in the comments. Let's just review some of those. Rick Skeptical observed that Udall was more of a follower of Christ than any person in the LDS leadership at the time. And that's one of those things where I think if you asked any Mormon back in the day, they would say that they followed Christ. But when you are put in a system where you have these men who claim to speak for God, to represent Christ, who hold you stuck in these ways of thinking that are fueled by bigotry and bias and all of what the church is calling folklore, it really prevents you from moving along with the compassion and empathy that you may be otherwise be awakened to in your own experience when you meet and interact with and realize the humanity and the equality of people. That's something that this devotion to the leaders blinded people to because they were so stuck in that dogmatic way. It's so easy to just follow the prophet and you don't have to think about these issues. If you want to call and comment, you can dial 210-422-2222. Let's see what else we got. Somebody observed that people who have written these uneducated, hateful letters have had and still have a polluted mind. Many of them passed on, and I'm pretty sure some have left the Mormon Church. What a doctrine. So certainly, if you speak to anyone who was alive in that era, all right, we got a call. Hold on, let's see what we got. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hi there. Calling from Idaho. I was alive when all this was going down in 1957.
Oh, really? You remember Udall's letter and the publication of it?
I remember the upset that it caused in our ward. I remember people talking about it. I was little. I was born in 47, but it was. I remember the upheaval it caused in the ward. I knew who Stewart Udall was, and then I was also alive in 1978 when the church came out and announced, when they came out and it came over the radio. We was in our truck in the desert driving, and it came over the radio. It was a big announcement that the blacks in the priesthood could now hold the priesthood, and I was also taught in mutual that we couldn't have one drop of black blood in us, and it wasn't called black back then, back in the day. So I've seen a lot of things happen with regard to the church, and anyway, I just wanted to call and comment.
Well, I appreciate your call. Now, I imagine you said you were younger when the Stewart Udall thing happened. Do you remember from your parents and maybe them discussing the issue with themselves or among ward members what the general feeling was? Did anyone feel safe defending the things that Udall said, or was it pretty uniform that people saw that what he did was an affront?
Well, being from Idaho, it was mostly Republican, a little bit Democrat back then in that day.
Really? Okay.
Around the quilt, the quilting bees, and that us kids would be, and the women would be talking, and in church, I remember the hitting of the pulpit, and how it was so much different than following a curriculum that we do nowadays.
Yeah.
In the Mormon Church, although I'm not a member of the Mormon Church now, but all of the upheaval, and also I do remember right about that same time, the women, the Relief Society had to turn over what power they had to the brethren. So it was a lot of upheaval then, and I was scared to death that I should ever have a baby, should it have one black drop of blood, because that's how we were taught.
The whole doctrine about the drop of blood thing is so, I mean, we see it now as so backward. There's a sociologist who's Mormon called Armin Moss, and he's written a lot about this issue. And there's a video interview with him where he talks about a young family that moved into the ward, and a young kid that joined him. He was a deacon, and he joined the deacon's quorum. And then somehow they discovered that, like, several generations before, there was a black person in their genealogy. And so this kid who had come, who to all appearances looked white, had to sit out of all of the different priesthood activities that they did because of that fact. So, that concept did affect people. And, we look back on it now and you just wonder, how in the world could people think these things back then? And
yes, how crazy could that be? But we were taught that, and of course we were taught not to date, and it sort of applied to more than just the blacks. It applied to more than just that, and of course we
no
were
mixing of any races type thing.
Yes, especially Indian, and it just makes me sick to even talk about it in terms of any way, because it's also disgusting to me now, and so I love your show.
Well, thanks for calling.
You're welcome.
All right, well, let's go ahead and open the lines up for somebody else. And if you get inspired to call again on another show, welcome you too. Thanks. And it's interesting connecting the world of, what we're seeing here in the late 1960s with today. When I first got this collection of letters digitized from the Stewart Udall collection, you can see, you saw a little bit in the little miniaturized screenshots there, that the names with all of these letters are redacted. And if you go to the website where this article is posted at thoughtsonthingsandstuff.com, you can link to the PDF file that has all of this source material that's been digitized, and the names are redacted. I felt that was important because there may be people still living today who wrote to Udall who probably have a very different perspective on what their words said at the time, and it would be uncomfortable and embarrassing to have that happen. But while I went through and did that, there were some familiar names, and I was able to locate somebody who wrote one of these letters who is still alive today, and had a chance to listen in on one of their family members who talked to them about it, about why they wrote it. And, reading the words now, is it something that they remember writing? And they did remember writing it, and they remember the mentality that went into it. And a lot of it was just, you're defending the church, you're defending the prophet. And here was somebody who, in a position of power and authority, was speaking out in a way that was embarrassing to the church and going against doctrine. And since that was what the church had proscribed as the reality, the doctrinal reality of the world, then that's what you do, you defend. And we're seeing, that take its own shape today in the modern social issues of this time point in human history with the Mormon Church. So, thank you so much. If there's anybody else that remembers this time period that's, still alive and kicking and paying attention to these issues, then by all means, please call and share your experience with us. Okay, so let's go back to some of these comments, and let's see here. Okay, we got another call in. Let's see where we go. Hello, you're on Talk and Things and Stuff.
Yeah, I grew up in that era,
Oh, hey.
and I remember it well. I
Do
don't
you?
remember the letters that he
Okay.
wrote, but I remember the lessons on not mixing race, and besides the black race, the Spanish race or the Indians, and one time there was a lady in our ward. I lived up in northern Utah in Cache Valley, and she was dating a Spanish gentleman that was a member of the church, and there was rumors about what she was doing, and she got up and passed a testimony meeting and just chewed the ward out. just told them there was none of their business, and that she could date who she wanted to date, and that she loved the guy, and I remember that real well.
Well, good for her.
And she went ahead and married him, and he was a real good active member, and so was she, and they had 4 kids, and I remember that era real well.
What is your memory of how those Sunday school lessons went when they taught some of these things? Was there ever any discussion about, is this really real? Is this like, what does this mean? Is it, is there any other way to look at it? Was there any pushback at all on these ideas?
No, there was very little pushback. I mean, if you push back, they'd kind of shun you, and
Yeah.
And I remember a seminary teacher that questioned a lot of things about the church, and they ended up excommunicating him.
Yeah.
And so the fear was in you. You just listened to what they told you, and you didn't dare push back.
Yeah, and that culture persists, where even if you personally disagree or have questions or doubt about some of the positions that the church holds, there are social consequences to you speaking out, so that you kind of, you remain quiet. And what ends up happening is, you sit in Sunday school, you look around and everybody else is quiet. You assume that everybody else is buying what they're shoveling. And so you start to feel very lonely, like maybe you're the only one that doesn't agree or see with it, and that has the effect of further isolating people.
Yeah, and I remember some guys would kind of push back, and then they told us, "Oh, he's a rebel."
Yeah.
He's a member, but he's a little bit off in left field.
That's
and
so
another
funny.
thing and another thing they referred to was, well, stay within the lessons. You don't want to go into anything outside the lessons, because we're not ready to understand all that, and we're just supposed to stay with what they tell you.
Yeah.
And that was what was hard for me when I finally left, was sitting in Sunday school and listening to them talk about scrolls and how Joseph Smith translated them and that they were true, and I just couldn't take it no more.
Yeah. It's true today as it was back in Udall's time, where he observed in, the first episode, the one of the problems with the church was that you have to either be 100% all in, or else you're essentially kicked out, because nobody allows any room for dissent, which is interesting, because if you've been paying attention to the recent changes with the new handbook of instructions, they've removed, it's kind of weird. They're playing it a little bit on both ways, but, one of the reasons for which a disciplinary hearing, which is now called a membership council or something like that, it used to be that apostasy was one, and so if somebody stood up and disagreed with things that the leaders taught, then that could be labeled as apostasy. And now that's no longer one of those mandatory disciplinary hearing things. So does that mean now that Sunday school is going to be reinvigorated as a place where people can really challenge narratives and try to develop a discussion that looks at more than a very simplistic third grade perspective at all these things? And I don't know if that's true.
I don't think so.
No.
They can rename it what they want, but they still tell you not to go outside what they teach you.
Yeah.
Don't venture from it.
Yeah, and they can still label you as an apostate even if there's no disciplinary hearing. People will say, well, you're teaching apostate things.
It's just like they came out and said, we're not going to be called Mormons anymore. It's going to call us the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Yeah. And that's not going to go away.
Yeah. No, it's not.
They can do what they want.
It's definitely still there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what was your experience when the priesthood ban was lifted? I know my mother has talked to me about this, and she says she remembers that there were people in the ward who stood up and walked out. They were upset that the priesthood was given to black people because I don't know. I guess you'd only have to guess as to why they were upset, whether they thought that the prophet was changing to go along with the times or what. Did you have any experiences like that?
Well, they keep teaching the church never changes. It's always the same. God don't change his ways, and then they come along and, finally gave the priesthood to them. And, there were members that outspoken and said they shouldn't have done that, and this is changing the way of the church and the teachings, the principles.
Yeah.
And that. And being in Utah, there wasn't any black members that I remember. There wasn't very few. So you really didn't meet any until you went to college or graduated, Or when I went in the service is when I met, the black race itself. And it was different. It was different when they changed it.
Yeah. That was one of the things that struck me when Elder Oaks got up at the B1 celebration in 2018 and related his own experience before and after the priesthood ban. And he essentially acknowledged that even before the ban was lifted, he prayed about the reasons that were being given for the ban. And his way of putting what was that he felt no confirmation of the truthfulness of any of it, which means that he determined that what they were teaching was false. So that the doctrine that they were draping around the priesthood ban was false. But his rationale for the fact that he never said anything about that was that it was more important to him to show loyalty to the brethren than to stand up for truth. And that type of example from somebody who was at a position where he was, already escalating in church position, it just shows you the type of values that they were rewarding, that they expected in the people who would rise to leadership positions, even apostle positions. And he's telling us that in 2018. And the only reason that he could be telling us that is because there's a moral there that he wants us to adopt for how we view the church and its leaders today. So even if we come to the determination that we believe that the things that the church is teaching around important social issues are false, then our duty is to show loyalty to the leaders rather than to stand up for truth. And that just does not work.
Yeah, and when I was going through that, I feel like it was just like when they had to give up polygamy. They were eventually forced into doing it.
Yeah,
and it was the same with the priesthood. Because there was so much anti stuff coming out about church not letting the blacks hold the priesthood that they finally made the change. And even then, I didn't feel it was from God. I felt just they were forced into it.
Yeah,
and it's the same thing they're going through right now with the gays and the lesbians. They just flip back and forth on their decisions, and it's nothing from God. It's just their lawyers and to keep themselves from getting in trouble.
Yeah, and it's funny that when you read these letters of these people who were alive in the 1960s responding to this issue, one of the things that they bring up again and again is that the church does not bend to social pressure. You know, the policies and the doctrine of the church come from God. They don't bend on the whims of men or anything like that. When, you know, as you observed on polygamy, on the issue of race, that's exactly what happened. And when you look at the more recent trajectory of the issues with the policies that they put out for gay families and the children of gay families, it's the same sort of thing. You can see that clearly there are social pressures that are weighing in on how the church changes. And the way that they've tried to gloss over, you know, the fact, as you observe, that the church has said for a long time, God is unchanging, God's standards don't change, you know, the gospel is
Yeah.
you know, in the past it was that the gospel and the church are restored, but now the way they've fixed that, they've said, oh, the restoration is ongoing. So if the restoration is ongoing, then anything could change at any point. And we've seen, you know, if something as supposedly sacred and fixed and restored as the temple ceremony can change in the way that it has, then anything can change. And
yeah,
go
and
ahead.
I went through the temple. Yeah, and I went through the temple back when they had all the, you know, cross your heart and cut out your, you know, innards and everything, and they just kept slowly changing stuff.
Yeah.
And you think, well, if it's supposed to be true and it's supposed to be non-changing, why they keep changing it?
Yeah.
And downplaying it.
Yeah. You know, it's one of those things where, you know, one of the questions I asked the prior caller is, you know, how did people believe these things back in the day? And I think even faithful Mormons today could say, well, you know, we believe these things because the prophets were the ones that taught them, but they had just, you know, they were speaking as men, not as prophets, when they repeated some of the racist folklore that was prevalent among everybody in America at that time. But that should not be a satisfying answer, because that's just telling you that the men claiming to be the mouthpiece of God are unable to distinguish between God's word and God's truth and the racist sentiments of, you know, mankind. And that further diminishes the standing that they should really hold as prophets, seers, and revelators. But, you know, it's really hard to get to that point if you're in the faithful mindset, because you don't want to accept anything that would put the prophets, you know, off of their pedestals.
And when I grew up in the church, you know, like I said before, you know, everything was focused on the church.
Yeah.
Your whole way of life was the church, and going to church and meetings, you know, during the weekday, and Sunday was 2 meetings a day, and you were taught that, you know, every day you had to live by the gospel, and so you get ingrained to where you don't dare question anything that they're doing or any changes they're doing. So you just go with the flow.
Yeah. Which is all well and good when you're talking about love your neighbor and be industrious and things like that. It's just when they use that same influence in your life to compel you to hold on to racist ideas or to bigoted ideas while society around you is yelling at you the truth of equality and compassion and empathy. That's where it just really goes wrong. And you know, it kind of takes someone claiming religious authority to be able to hold you in that frozen point.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's getting late. Time to go to sleep. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for calling in. It's always great to hear from you.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
It's nice talking to you again. Thank you.
Bye now. All right. Well, it is getting late. Certainly, let's see. I just want to make sure I covered all of our comments. If anyone else wants to call in, you're welcome to, but otherwise we'll shut it down soon here. All right. So Rick Skeptical follows up. The part on not questioning leadership is very disturbing. Any prophet can declare almost anything. members are morally unaccountable due only to obedience, not for following what is right and moral. And that's really where it becomes a challenge, because you have to determine whether you're going to follow the prophet or follow your conscience. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Becomes a challenge because you have to determine whether you're going to follow the prophet or follow your conscience. All right, can you hear me?
Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Well, it's getting late, but I want to congratulate you to your show.
Why don't you, if you can mute your computer in the background and listen on the phone, that way we'll prevent that echo.
I just turned it off. I'm
Excellent.
You know, just a quick thought about the black people. I came to the States in 1960, 21 years old. And the first person that really impressed me was where I started working in a company. It was black individual, skilled, and he was the most helpful, nicest person I could meet in the very beginning when I came to this country. It was in California. So that's about it. Now, as far as the letters, the negative letters you read and showed, I was really astonished that people could feel that way and think that way. I did join the church in 1957 in Berlin, Germany, and I was about 15 years old. Shows you how old I am. I did meet people up there. I met Edward F. Benson up there in Berlin. They came and visited during the early days. You know, they traveled all over the world. I met and personally talked to him even, and met a lot of these speakers like Kimball. David O. McKay was here in 54, or no, 55. Yeah.
So even as a youth, you were able to interact with these leaders as they visited.
Yeah, and you know, for me it was fascinating as a young person. And to be really honest, I did love the religion until I heard about the separation of the black people, that they couldn't get the priesthood. Well,
that was the issue that first caused you problems with the church?
Well, you know, when what I learned in school in my younger days, I was told, when you know it's true, you got to see it and touch it, then you know it's real. Now, we all, even the little kids, when they go to Sunday school, they say, I know that Jesus Christ lives. I know the prophet is true.
Yeah.
They don't know that. And that's how the adults react, the same way, you know, which there's always that little doubt in everybody's mind, you know, is it really true? And I even talked to some people, you know. I still haven't left the church. I've been a member for 67 years. I was a member for 65 years. My wife passed away about 7 years ago, and she told me before she died, she said, you find yourself another woman, you're a good man, and this and that. So I found a girlfriend, and she told me one time, you know, your church is a cult, you know, and
oh, wow.
and the prophets, they're getting paid for it. They're getting big money. No, I was under the belief, you know, they don't get any money. That's honorable position and this and that. They're called by God. So we almost had a fallout, you know. But there's always that little doubt, but I still believe my own belief. Until a friend of mine told me just about a couple of years ago, he said, you know, they're getting paid. They're getting like $125,000 a month. So that's when I started my research with podcasts, buying books, reading 2 different versions of the massacre of Mountain
Meadows Massacre, yeah.
Yeah, and it really opened my eyes what was going on, you know.
How did it feel at that point to see that essentially you'd been lied to?
Well, I still feel bad. the fact is, there are so many good people. You know, they're good moments. I even play golf with them, and they know I'm kind of disassociated because I'm not going to church with them. But we play golf, we talk. They're very polite. They used to work for me some 40, 50 years ago, some of them. They're contractors. I used to be a general contractor. So they're good people. But then there's some of them I met. I got gypped out of a lot of money. False testimonies have been born against me, which I even got reprimanded from the state president. It didn't bother me. I forgive. You know, I'm above this. But it's really, it opened my eyes when I had to see my family, all my family members, my daughters, they disassociated from the church. My grandchildren, they don't go to church anymore. So, and I have a lot of friends, even from Europe. There's so many of them. They're just leaving because we got the internet, the ability to, if you want to find out something, you find out.
Yeah.
And I did find out even some people I met in Berlin, you know, because of my age, some of the members in Berlin and the war that were involved in the war. I don't know if you heard about Erich Krause.
No, tell me.
There was a book written. He was a high priest in genealogy in Berlin. He was a very big shot up there, but he was in prison, and the state presidency bailed him out of prison. He was in prison in 1954 for committing some pretty bad acts during the war.
Really?
Really gross acts, you know. And I even had a call from one of his sons. I knew him personally. I knew his sons. They live in California, too. One of them lives in California. And they even told me about what he did. And even me, it was hard to believe that he was involved in these. I don't know, they're so gross I don't even want to talk to you about
Now,
them.
there's a book called Moroni and the Swastika by David Nelson, which dug into a lot of the history of how the church interacted with the Nazi regime and with what was going on in Germany. Is his story in that book?
Yes, that's what I mean.
Okay.
And it's, you know, there was talk even between the members like me. I was a young guy. And my friends, there's something wrong with this guy. You know, he's been in the military, and he did this and that. He is this and that. And, you know, hard to believe when you're young, but then when you find out, just when I start reading it, I got about 20 books I bought. The good ones and the bad ones. And it's very interesting what people believe and what they shouldn't believe.
Yeah. And I think
it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, and what we're seeing on this issue with race in America in 1960s is the same sort of symptom that would have been related in stories from the book of Moroni and the Swastika, where people are given reasons to go along with things that in any other context they should be able to recognize are immoral, but because there's an authority involved that allows them to kind of displace that moral accountability onto the authority, it allows them to go along with things that they would not otherwise go along with. And that's one of the phenomenons of being human that you'll find both in religion and in political organizations as well.
Yes, and that's we can even read up on it in the history of the church, you know, what Brigham Young taught. You know, he taught some pretty bad things, you know, like, you know, with what black and white person, if they engage in sex or whatever, they should be killed with a javelin. I mean, I read so much stuff, it's mind-boggling. How could I ever believe in that? But that's the power of, you believe what you want to believe and how you feel good about it, but the facts are mostly different.
Yeah, and for a lot of the stuff like you're talking about, those ugly Brigham Young quotes, a lot of that was they hid those quotes from you. Like you weren't exposed to those, certainly when you were a convert, when they were teaching you about the church. And even then, when you join the church and you go to Sunday school and you figure, I've had, 2 hours of lessons every week for a decade, that's like 500 hours of lessons, or 1,000 hours of lessons. I should have a college education on church history by the time a few decades have come by. And then you go and you start reading the source documents and you're like, how come in all of that time I was never shown the reality that Brigham Young taught stuff like this? And that's just where you show that a lot of
That's
that,
correct.
a lot of it is just outright deception and whitewashing.
Yes, yes. And even I didn't know, even up to a couple of years ago, I didn't know that Joseph Smith had so many wives.
Yeah, I was in the same boat.
That was new to me. How could that be? I knew about Brigham Young because when I visited Salt Lake City about 40 years ago, you go to the temple grounds and this and that with your wife. Oh, well, he had some wives. That was his privilege because he was a prophet and polygamy was okay. Wow. And now Joseph Smith had so many, and then you read about all the others. Especially, I read 2 different books about the Meadow Mountain Massacre. One of them written by different authors. One of them was a Mormon living in somewhere in Utah, and the other one by 3 different authors. Both of them basically the same. One of them had more information about actual documentation from the involvement they had with the President of the United States at that time.
Yeah.
But it's horrific.
Yeah.
I mean, it took me a while to really to digest it, what happened up there.
Yeah, the book by Will Bagley called Blood of the Prophets is one of the best examinations of that episode in church history. And, for any of the viewers, if you go and you study that, you want to study what led up to the massacre itself, but also look at what happened afterwards, what they did with the children, what the church did to initially deny responsibility or culpability, and just how all of that went. And it's something that really should educate you about the dangers of blind obedience to, false dogma, and it should be very sobering.
Well, there's still blind obedience going on, and you know it, and I know it, and it's not very nice.
Yeah.
But they basically still hide a lot of stuff, what's going on, and blind obedience is very important, and some people really believe that's going to help them to the celestial kingdom.
Yeah.
Now, when I did believe up to a couple of years ago, when I became aware of all this really false doctrine, I said, what the heck? I don't want to be ever God living there with these other people and fighting with them.
You don't want to share the celestial kingdom with them?
No way. I don't have any interest in that. And, I changed my attitude quite a bit. I love the people. Most of the people are all right. I'd say 98% of them are super, but watch out for the rest of them.
Yeah.
I had my bad experience.
Well, I'm sorry about that. But thank you so much for sharing your kind of your life story and journey in the church.
Well, again, I like your program.
Well, I appreciate it. And feel free to call in again. Okay, great. Well, we'll look forward to hearing from you again. Take care.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. To finish up on this issue about questioning leadership, that is a really dangerous thing. There have been a bunch of people, researchers, who have gone back to look at some of the moral atrocities that happened in World War II around the Nazi regime to try to figure out, how could seemingly moral people commit these atrocious acts? and feel like they were on the side of good in doing it. And a lot of this concept of displacing your moral accountability to some agent higher than you is an aspect of human psychology that people adopt in these settings that psychologists have been able to kind of replicate in experimental settings. There's something called the Stanley Milgram experiments. If you just Google Stanley Milgram experiments, you'll see some people who've tried to dig down into human psyche and develop a test to see how far somebody would go in doing something that they knew was going to hurt somebody else if they were simply instructed to do so by somebody who was an authority figure who said, I'll take all responsibility for it. Because that's the type of paradigm that is set up that is a recipe for these moral atrocities, whether they be something like what the Nazis did in World War II or whether they be something like the Mountain Meadows Massacre. All right. The Mormon doctrine is provably false. Why the cult still exists, I don't know, is a comment from a viewer. I think if you go and you look at the history of other groups that people would give the name cult to, you can see some of the things that they do to survive, to gain new members, and some of it is very effective. Some of it is the same sort of strategies that media agencies use for commercials. Some of it draws upon the same feelings of a desire for inclusivity, for having a network, a social network around of you. Some of it is appealing to the noble sentiments of the human heart and giving a spiritual paradigm that would seem to give expression for that. And, in each of these instances, there's kind of the bait and there's the trap. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between them. But there are very powerful psychological reasons that these things persist. All right. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, John, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. What's on your mind?
Hey, I miss seeing Yugi. I don't know why we haven't had Yugi lately, but
he's decided to be a naughty pooch, and he runs around too much, and I'm sick of finding Tootsie Rolls everywhere. I'll have to collar him and have him stay.
Well, I remember to turn my thing down first this time. So, hey, I got just a quick comment. Oh, geez, these letters are just, I've never heard them before. They are just atrocious. But
Yeah.
one of the letters said, and maybe even a couple times if I remember right, because I was listening to him, it says, how dare you presume to tell the prophet what to do, the prophet. So
Yeah.
as everything's going on, the ex-Mormon, the movement, I'm following you. You do a great job, by the way. So there's some of your videos I've watched more than once, and you're at the top of my list. So anyway, but
Thanks.
they they say, okay, we want to build a bridge. I can understand the building a bridge, and then I hear the term a lot. We're going to help the church. We're helping the church, and every time I hear that, I kind of bristle because I'm thinking, do you think they want your help? I think even today they have that kind of same attitude. You presume to tell the prophet what to do.
Yeah.
You respect our authority, and I mean, does it make sense? Am I the only one? Every time I hear the term, we're going to help the church. Does it make sense?
You're talking about maybe progressive people who see some of the issues and still stay within the church, and they say, we're staying in the church because we're going to help the church to grow. We're going to help elevate the church to get rid of some of these problems. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, I've just heard the term we help the church, and I know that like with the changes to the handbook, a lot of people are celebrating kind of that. Hey, we have basically we have forced change. We've helped force.
You may be referring then to, like, I think John DeLynn has posted a few times about, hey, it's the outside critics of the church that are helping the church to, come along to the modern sensibilities or something like that. We've been the force for change. Sam Young,
Sure,
ordained women.
Yeah, I'm on top of that. I agree, but and it does church in a way against their will. But don't you think they're just like dying? They're like, they're hating it. It's like, we have the authority. I'm the prophet. So I just always, every time I hear that term, I'm like, they don't want your help. I don't think they do.
Well, I think there's the kind of there's different perspectives, kind of like you can look at a scene from the mountaintop, you can look at it from the valley. You're still looking at the same stuff, but you're seeing different views and different perspectives. And I agree with you from the perspective of the leadership. They're not eager to, I think it's probably painful for them to make changes that have been called for by the lay membership, because it kind of reveals a little bit that their hand is being shifted by social pressure, and that's kind of exactly what they don't want to have, because they've taught so long that, the whole point of following the brethren is so that when the shifting tides of society around you is just, like shafts in the whirlwind or whatever, then the steady hand of the brethren will keep you on the straight and narrow. When if the brethren... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, they cannot lead you astray.
Yeah, exactly. And so when they see something where, they're like, if Sam Young has become enlightened to the idea that they need drastic changes to these policies around worthiness interviews before the brethren do, then now, if they come to the point where they have to make the change, they now have to somehow frame the change so that it didn't come from the pressure from Sam Young. It came from, the brethren on high. And it's almost, I think, on that issue and on the issue of an apology for race and institutional accountability on that, I've heard critics of some of these vocal activists like Sam Young say, you can't go at it the way that you're going at it, because you're not giving the church the ability to make the changes and seem like they're the ones who did it. You have to back off so that the church can make those changes and claim the authority for it. And I just think that's that's the root of the problem. A lot of this is, the way that I approach it, and I think different activists will approach it differently, but my approach is like, I don't need the church to change. And the things that I do is not so much to get the church to change. I think there's more positive benefit that's going to happen from waking people up to the difference between the church authority control paradigm in how they view themselves and how they view the world, from centering their own authority and power in their life and the decisions that they make and how they view the world within themselves, so that they can start to trust their own voice and their own conscience and no longer rely on the brethren for those things. And so that's kind of the change that I would like to see happen, is for people to liberate themselves. And then it doesn't matter what the church does. But on the other side of that, there is this reality where until that happens for every individual person, then people that we love and care for are still, under the boot of the church. And so if there are things that can be done so that the church makes positive changes, then those are to be celebrated. And it may be that some of the criticisms that we give voice to can affect some of those changes, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I don't frame most of what I do as that the entire goal is to help the church or to change the church. I think there's more meaningful change to be made in the hearts and minds of individuals who start to trust themselves more. Yeah.
Very, very well put. I've learned that I'm a black and white thinker. I turned 60 this year, and I was in the church for almost 40 years of my adult life, and I can't believe I didn't wake up sooner. But
that thing about being a black and white thinker is, I think I'm the same way, because that's the very concrete church that we were raised in. And that's where, things that are true, and things that are false, and you can trust the authority. The authority is legitimate. All these things, even the subtle things down to, when somebody gives a talk and they cite Webster's dictionary, the definition of what I'm going to talk about is this. Those are all appeals to authority so that you can put the matter to rest. And it's part of this black and white thinking that we have. And I think that's part of why there's this real rejection and kind of a bristling at some of what people are labeling neo-apologetics, where they go in and they're like, well, no, it's not this black and white thing. There's so much nuance, and there's all these shades of gray that are okay. And you're just like, go back in time 15 years and hit us with this nuance thing, and you would get shut down in a heartbeat. But that's just an aside from that.
Hey, Bruce R. McConkie, the caravan moves on.
Yes.
There's some dogs nipping our heels. He stood up and he just boldly proclaimed, there was no weaselness. You got to give him credit. He wasn't a weasel. He laid it on out, man.
Yeah. And I think we still have some of the apostles that are in that mode of thought. And It's as a activist slash critic, it's a lot easier to disassemble, and point out the problems with that black and white thinking. And I think it's going to get harder once you get more apostles and leaders who do this weaselly, mealy-mouthed, metaphorical approach to it. Even though I'm hoping that when they go to that, it has to give more space for some of the different approaches to the scripture, different approaches to religion. And that's healthy, I think, if people who want to see the Book of Mormon, for example, as spiritual fiction rather than as a historical account, and they still find value in fellowship with the saints, seeing it as that way, then I think that's a good thing, because it still gives them space to define what the thing is in their own mind. And if the church lets them do that, then maybe they can find a way that makes it work where they're still empowering themselves, and so they don't feel restricted by dogma.
Yeah, I love the community. I miss the community. So many good people, like the gentleman before was saying. But hey, but I appreciate you, John. And please, more evil apostate. Come on, man. Apostate. You got to do some more, okay?
All right. He'll come back.
All right. Hey, thanks a lot, man. Good night.
Right. Take care. All right. Well, we got more calls than I thought we were going to get for this late night show on Sunday night. You guys should be going to bed. You got work tomorrow. All right. Let's see. We got another comment. The culture is still present today. I'm reminded of talking to a man in Germany in 1976. Really, he talked about growing up in the Hitler Nazi youth movement and about indoctrination and regrets. There is no true church. Churches are of men. Only Jesus is true. Jesus didn't teach hate. Jesus or men choose the right. I think that when you encounter, there's a lot of different people who come out of Mormonism and find spiritual homes in other ways of thinking, other paradigms. Some of them are religious, and they maintain their Christian identity. But when you talk to them about what that looks like, it's so different from Mormon Christianity, because Mormon Christianity is really rooted in this hierarchy or authority paradigm where you have to bend your mind and your conscience to the parameters that are set by the religious authority and the religious leaders above. And if you talk to these people who come out of Mormonism and still have a Christian identity and a reverence for the Christ that they've discovered outside of Mormonism, that paradigm is much less authoritarian for having to, bow your head to other men of authority, and much more them formulating what they would see as a Christian conscience rooted in love and applying that to the world today. And it's just a very different paradigm. And certainly there are a lot of people who abandon religion altogether, and that I think has its own set of challenges, because you're starting over to develop your own moral framework for how you still, define right and wrong and what you do it. And it's very, very possible. There are plenty of people who are able to establish a moral ethic even without having to appeal to a spiritual authority. And they're still good people, and they're compassionate, and they're, a joy to be around. And their jokes are a lot more funny, so it's all good. All right, so let's see here. Those who continue to double down on trying to maintain the truth claims at this time in world's history, like the supporters of Trump, the sense of being agile versus solid, sure foundation. Yeah, that's the thing that I think you'll learn when you start to explore how people get blinded to certain realities in religion, and you start looking for those same sort of phenomena that happen. You'll see them happen in politics all the time. And it's not just Republicans. It happens for any brand of politics. And that has been one of the kind of educating things for me as I've gone through this process, is to start to see that. And I think you start to realize it's just an unavoidable aspect of human nature. And by being aware of how these things work, you can try to avoid it in yourself, but you'll find yourself tripping up and falling into these things, and you'll discover that, you've fallen for another type of fallacy. And certainly, just like in identifying it in Trump followers, it's always easier to see in somebody who's not in your own protected ethnocentric, politicocentric, or religiocentric space. It's always easier to see it in somebody else. All right. Let's see here. All right. So I think we've done a good job tonight. We're at just under 2 hours, so let's go ahead and wrap it up. Again, this has been part 4 of the Stewart Udall sequence. Part 5, next, we're going to hear not from the members who wrote to Udall, but we're going to hear from apostles who wrote to Udall to give them their perspective on his letter from the position of an authority figure in the church. So, until next time, this is Thoughts on Things and Stuff and Talk on Things and Stuff, and good night.